Across the wires and through the air, those who seek will find me there. Story, wonder, voice, and art, find the ears and find the heart. There are some cities where music feels like entertainment. And then there's New Orleans. In New Orleans, music spills out of halls, doorways, and open windows at all hours of the day, and pours into gutters and open ears. Music there doesn't behave. It possesses people. And I mean that almost literally. Because long before jazz became America's great art form, before the blues became the sound of heartbreak itself, before tourists stumbled drunk through Bourbon Street, clutching hurricanes and beads, there were crossroads. There were spirits waiting where the roads divided. There were drums carrying memories across the Atlantic. There were rituals disguised as songs. There were people discovering that rhythm could alter the body, loosen the mind, and transport human beings somewhere else, somewhere liminal. And throughout history, people have understood music not simply as entertainment, but as ritual technology, a way to invoke the gods, to alter consciousness, to grieve, to heal, to remember, to survive. There's a reason conservative churches once called blues and jazz the devil's music. Not because it was sensual or because it was played in bars and brothels and juke joints, but because the music did something powerful. It loosened people. It dissolved boundaries. Boundaries between bodies, between strangers, between sorrow and ecstasy, between the self and something larger. In that vein of fear, the fear of music and what it does is much older than the American blues. Long before the devil was said to wait at the crossroads, humans already feared the places where roads divide. Welcome, dear listener, to Wishcrafting. Today, we are walking old roads together. So lace up your boots and let's get moving, because I am sure you don't want to be out here by the crossroads all alone, do you? Listener, there are places in the world that just feel different, no matter who you are. Places where the air changes, where your stomach tightens slightly for no clear reason, or where the night suddenly feels aware of you. The Crossroads is one of those places. It's not merely an intersection of roads, but an intersection of possibilities. Do you go left, right, forward, back, and perhaps more importantly, who or what is waiting when you do choose a direction? For thousands upon thousands of years, humans have believed that crossroads are spiritually charged places, thresholds, meeting points, places where the living world brushes against something other. And that makes sense. Before highways and traffic lights, roads themselves were dangerous. To travel meant to make yourself vulnerable. It meant distance from the safety of the village walls or your hearth. The wilderness between settlements held storms, bandits, wolves, sickness, and the unknown. And a crossroads multiplied that uncertainty. A crossroads is a pause, a decision point, and humans have always understood that to possess a very strange power. Just like doorways, riverbanks, shorelines, dusk, dawn, or midnight, even birth or death, moments where things become something else, we have the crossroads. Not just a physical place, they are also an idea, a concept, and they are liminal, neither here nor there. And liminal places attract spirits throughout folklore, because spirits themselves are liminal beings. So naturally, the crossroads became theirs. If we are speaking of crossroads magic, we must eventually speak of Hecate, one of the queens that I serve. She is so much, but most of the time she is described as an ancient goddess of witchcraft, ghosts, torches, thresholds, and night wandering. Long before Christianity associated the crossroads with the devil, the crossroads belonged to her. Hecate was often depicted standing at a three-way crossroads, holding twin torches, triple formed and watching every direction at once. And there's something pretty unsettling, but also beautiful about that image. A goddess, standing where the roads divide, seeing every possible future before you can even choose one. Offerings called Depnon were left for Hecate at the crossroads, and usually these offerings consisted of eggs, garlic, cakes, fish, and other morsels from the everyday table. These offerings weren't merely gifts, but they were negotiations and appeasements, because crossroads were believed to attract the restless dead and wandering spirits. Hecate's Depnon is interesting because in leaving these things at the crossroads and feeding the restless dead that wait for her there, or that are walking beside her when she passes by, you're at once recognizing who she is, just by partaking in this ritual, saying that you see her and recognize her as the mighty dread goddess that she is. But there's a second part to it where you're also giving her some help, aiding her in wrangling these restless spirits. At least, that's how I've always seen it. I'm sure she doesn't necessarily need that help, but damn, isn't it nice when somebody gives you a helping hand? Anyway, we're going to put a pin in that conversation for now. For now, let's just consider that historically, witchcraft itself often lives in the margins, and magic or witchcraft often thrives where those margins are, where the lines blur. And crossroads are places that are made entirely of blurring. In many places, crossroads became associated with the dead. In medieval Europe, suicides and criminals were sometimes buried at the crossroads. Why? Well, partially because crossroads were believed to confuse spirits. The belief was that a restless dead person might become disoriented there and unable to find their way back among the living. And there's something perhaps poetic, but also maybe ironic, and also very unsettling about that thought. A soul trapped forever at a place of choices, unable to move forward when there are so many different places to go. These are the souls that Hecate guided back to Hades eventually. As time went on, crossroads also became places where magical practitioners disposed of their ritual remains. Offerings, wax, bones, ashes, and what was left over from their workings. Even today, many folk traditions utilize the crossroads as spiritually charged disposal sites. And it's not because they're viewing what they're doing as littering. They don't view these things that they need to dispose of as trash. rather the remains or remnants that need their remaining energy to be transferred or recycled. You leave something at the crossroads because the crossroads carry things away, so that the energy or the working can find a path back to its natural place, or back to the earth itself to be recycled. However, that is a very modern take. Long before that, as Christianity spread across Europe, many older liminal spirits and gods that were associated with the crossroads became recast through a Christian lens. And, as a surprise to no one, those spirits and deities often became devils. But, my dear listener, the old gods rarely disappear. More often, they change masks. Somewhere down the line and out of the Mississippi mud, an image emerged, a dark figure waiting beneath the moonlight, offering power in exchange for something precious: your soul, your loyalty, your name. This figure took root in the American South, burying itself in the cracks of cobbled streets and the gnarled branches of the live oaks, and never let go. But this figure did not come out of nowhere. The American South already carried older spiritual currents within it: African rhythms, diasporic traditions, and ecstatic rituals. Music used not simply for entertainment, but for survival. And nowhere did those traditions root themselves more deeply than in New Orleans. If you want to understand the spiritual roots of New Orleans, look to the music. And to look to the music, you have to begin in Congo Square. It's difficult to overstate how important this place is. In the 1700s and early 1800s, enslaved Africans in New Orleans were allowed, on Sundays, to gather in an open area just outside of the French Quarter known as Congo Square. Now, to be clear, this existed within the horrific reality of slavery. Nothing about this should be romanticized. But within that brutality, something extraordinary survived. African rhythms, dances, songs, religious practices, and call-and-response traditions all survived within the drum beats carried across the Atlantic in human memory. And unlike many parts of the American South where drumming by enslaved people was heavily outlawed after revolts, New Orleans remained a uniquely Caribbean cultural atmosphere, shaped by French and Spanish colonial influence. So, on Sundays, Congo Square became a place where fragments of entire worlds resurfaced. Witnesses described circles of dancers moving in rhythm for hours beneath the Louisiana sun. Bodies swaying, drums beating continuously, singing rising and falling in waves. And, if you read those historical accounts carefully, many observers describe something remarkably close to trance, because rhythm does something ancient to human beings. Repetition changes consciousness. Steady percussion alters breathing. Movement synchronizes groups emotionally and physically. Modern neuroscience confirms this now, but traditional cultures have understood it forever. Drumming can induce ecstatic states. And across countless spiritual traditions worldwide, from voodoo ceremonies to Sufi mysticism to Dionysian rites, music has long been used as a bridge between ordinary consciousness and altered states. It is a threshold technology. And importantly, Congo Square was not isolated from the wider landscape surrounding New Orleans. There are historical accounts and oral traditions describing the indigenous peoples of the region assisting enslaved Africans to escape the city or to slip away during the loosened oversight of Sundays. From Congo Square with assistance, the swamps around New Orleans became both a refuge and a pillar of resistance. Places where maroon communities, indigenous groups, and escaped enslaved people could disappear into the wetlands themselves. And I think that matters when we talk about the spiritual atmosphere that surrounds Congo Square, because it shows us that the square wasn't just a place of music, it was a crossroads of culture, of survival, of memory, and of spirit. And, dear listener, this is where Crossroads folklore and musical folklore finally become the same story. Because what is a trance if not a threshold? What is improv if not stepping briefly into the unknown? That's the crossroads. The crossroads is a threshold of the unknown. A paradox of both pause and decision. The crossroads was never just a place. Sometimes the crossroads can even be the human nervous system, your body itself. Your nervous system is reactive. And one thing that modern culture forgets is that music used to be considered dangerous. Not metaphorically, actually dangerous. Religious authorities throughout history repeatedly feared ecstatic music because ecstatic states weaken social control. People act differently in trance, and they become temporarily ungovernable because your nervous system is hardwired to react to vibration. And thus, your nervous system is hardwired to react to music. And you can see how these threads cross. How the fear of blues and jazz came to be. Early jazz was condemned as vulgar, primitive, sinful, and animalistic. White moral authorities in the early 20th century often described jazz musicians as though they were summoning chaos itself. And beneath the racism, there was also genuine fear of ecstasy. Because jazz destabilized people. The rhythms were syncopated and sensual. The music invited, no, it coaxed you into surrender. And the blues perhaps frightened people even more. The blues never offered any kind of tidy redemption. It sat very openly with all the heartbreak, desire, loneliness, and grief mixed into the sexuality and vices that can be found within a life of poverty. The blues looked directly at suffering without flinching. And that, as you might assume, made many religious conservatives very deeply uncomfortable. For much of the early 20th century in the American South, blues music was openly condemned by both black and white church communities as the devil's music. To many conservative religious listeners, the genre represented everything worldly and dangerous. Sensuality, drinking, gambling, desire, emotional excess, and rebellion against strict moral expectations. This music thrived in juke joints and barrel houses, smoky spaces that were associated with nightlife, alcohol, dancing, and prostitution. Places that the church warned people against. And unlike spirituals, which focused on salvation and redemption, the blues spoke honestly about the realities of earthly life. All the heartbreak, misery, poverty, temptation, longing, and imperfection of being a human being. The music became associated with sin, not simply because of where it was played, but because of what it awakened in people. Blues loosened emotional restraint. It invited listeners to feel things openly. And for many religious authorities, that kind of vulnerability and ecstasy combined felt dangerous. Music that could move the body so deeply was often viewed with suspicion throughout history. And the folklore only deepened that fear. Stories spread of musicians meeting dark figures at lonely crossroads beneath the moonlight. Tales of impossible talent appearing overnight. Perhaps most famously, we have the legend of Robert Johnson, who sold his soul to the devil in exchange for mastery of the guitar. This became one of the most enduring myths in American music history, and more on that in a moment. Whether people literally believe these stories or not almost doesn't matter. Folklore survives because it feels emotionally true. And genius often does feel supernatural. Some listeners or colonialists were also deeply unsettled by the music's roots in African and African American traditions. The rhythms, the call and response, the repetition and improvisation echoed older spiritual systems that were carried across the Atlantic in the memories and bodies of enslaved people. Beneath the racism and moral panic surrounding blues and jazz was also that fear of ecstasy itself. Because, like I said, ecstatic music weakens control. It dissolves boundaries. It dissolves whatever lies between sorrow and pleasure, and it allows us to tap in to something that feels bigger. But, despite all of the accusations, the music isn't evil. And it continued. It persisted. Jazz, blues, it was survival. It was emotional honesty. A deeply human art form created by people enduring enormous hardship and refusing to let suffering silence them. The blues became a kind of medicine for grief and longing and joy and exhaustion, as well as just survival itself. And perhaps that is what frightened people most of all. Not the devil, but the raw, undeniable truth of being alive. Music is and was powerful, but especially blues and jazz, and you can feel that physically. There's a reason that so many descriptions of blues and jazz use almost supernatural language. Improv within blues and jazz especially fascinates me spiritually, because true improv requires surrender. A jazz musician can't fully control what emerges in the moment. They respond instinctively, emotionally, intuitively to the currents that are moving through the room. And when improv brings one into the flow state, that's when it becomes truly transcendent. And this is something that musicians talk about. It's a phenomenon that is termed getting out of the way. And it's all about entering a flow state, which I've talked about on the podcast before. When a musician gets out of the way and into the music moves through them rather than from them. And when we use language to describe something like that, it starts sounding suspiciously close to mysticism. Almost like they're channeling something. And maybe that's part of why jazz feels so alive compared to heavily engineered modern music. Blues and jazz, they still contain unpredictability, human risk, human spirit. a conversation unfolding in real time between bodies, memory, emotion, and instinct. Now, no discussion of the devil's music would be complete without Robert Johnson, perhaps the most famous Crossroads legend in America. According to folklore, Johnson was once an unremarkable guitarist, but one night he had it, and he decided that his time in his quiet, small Mississippi town was up. And so, as he was leaving town, walking, he just so happened to pass by a crossroads at midnight. And from the shadows a dark figure appeared. No one knows just who this dark figure was, but everyone liked to guess. Regardless, the figure took Johnson's guitar, tuned it, and returned it, after which both Johnson and the guitar were transformed. From that day on, Johnson played with impossible skill. Now, there are rational explanations to this, sure, like perhaps Johnson left his town to see the world and study under better musicians. But folklore rarely survives because it's rational. Folklore survives, like I said, because it feels emotionally true. And the emotional truth of this story is powerful. Genius feels supernatural. It feels like you're tuning into something when you see someone in that zone. Whether you are the one in the zone or not, it feels big. Especially when the art seems to consume the artist. Robert Johnson's music already carried an uncanny atmosphere. Restlessness and haunting and chock full of desire, right beside some pretty visceral death imagery. And when he died young, under mysterious circumstances, his legend only deepened. But I think this Crossroads story says something pretty profound about art itself. To become extraordinary often does feel like you're making a bargain. You're sacrificing something. Whether it's sleep, stability, comfort, your relationships, or just normalcy in general, something is always given over. And perhaps that's what people truly meant when they say or said, musicians have sold their souls. This motif of meeting the devil at the crossroads, particularly musicians meeting the devil at the crossroads or having some assistance from the devil, is an old story. Stringed instruments and the devil have been intertwined in folklore for centuries. Robert Johnson may be the most famous American version of the tale, but long before blues guitars haunted the crossroads of Mississippi, the devil's nimble fingers were already wrapped around the fiddle. And the fiddle is, of course, simply a violin by another name. It's called a violin when it's played in concert halls, and it's a fiddle when it's playing folk music. Across Europe, fiddlers occupied a very strange place in folklore. They were admired, desired, and feared all at once, because fiddles make people move. They stir emotion directly through the body. In old stories, the devil himself was often imagined as a fiddler, playing at the crossroads, leading ghostly dances, or luring travelers and revelers into ecstatic frenzies that lasted until dawn or until death. When it comes to a devilish fiddle, perhaps no one is more famous than Niccolò Paganini, a legendary Italian violinist and composer. Paganini was composing music by the age of 7 and performing publicly by the age of 11. His skill was so extraordinary, so unnatural seeming to audiences of the time, that rumors swelled around him like storm clouds. People whispered that no ordinary human could play the way that he did. And this is a very well-documented rumor mill. Some claimed that he had sold his soul to the devil in exchange for the mastery over the violin. Others believed that he was literally possessed while performing, or that some darker spirit moved through him while he played. One particularly gruesome rumor claimed that he had murdered a woman and crafted violin strings from her vocal cords, and that those sensitive to spirits could still hear her screams hidden beneath the music when he played. Now, as always, there are more grounded explanations, of course. Modern historians have speculated that Paganini may have had a connective tissue disorder like EDS or Marfan syndrome, conditions that could have contributed to his unusually long, flexible fingers and a remarkable reach across the violin. But folklore has never been particularly interested in practical explanations, and Paganini was far from the only musician accused of consorting with dark forces. Again and again throughout history, stories emerged of gifted artists encountering the devil in dreams. A shadowed figure teaching impossible melodies, revealing hidden techniques, or performing music so beautiful and so terrible that the dreamer would spend the rest of their life trying to recreate it upon waking. Extraordinary talent can feel supernatural when witnessed up close, especially music. Music bypasses logic and moves directly into the nervous system. I think that's why music and the supernatural have been tangled together for so long, because at their core, both music and magic alter your consciousness. They transport you briefly outside of yourself and create moments where ordinary reality feels thinner than usual. And nowhere in the world is that transformation more visible than in New Orleans. Particularly in their funerary traditions, because in New Orleans, music doesn't merely accompany grief, it carries it. It dances with it. My dear listener, have you ever heard of a jazz funeral? A jazz funeral is one of the most profoundly human rituals I've ever witnessed. It is pretty much exactly what it sounds like. A funeral accompanied by jazz. The procession begins slowly and mournfully as brass instruments cry through narrow streets while black-clad families walk behind and beside the casket. And then, gradually, something changes. The rhythm lifts and drums quicken and sorrow transforms into movement. Alongside the beloved dead, people dance, not because grief disappears, but because life continues moving beside it. And for me, that feels ancient, like ritual. The music carries mourning bodies forward, and it turns grief communal. And with that, the music becomes a crossing over ceremony that is guided by rhythm, a threshold technology and rite. And I think that that is the true heart of New Orleans music. The refusal, the flat-out refusal to let suffering flatten the human experience and the soul. So, perhaps the devil at the crossroads was never really about evil. Maybe it was always about transformation, about the terrifying moment that something enters your life, your body, or your soul, and changes you permanently. Something that asks for sacrifice and gives something powerful back in return. To recognize and be part of the divine. To see and be the divine. Engaging in rhythm. Maybe that's why blues and jazz frightened people so deeply. Not because they were sinful, but because they were honest. honest about their longing and suffering and ecstasy and desire and the beautiful, terrible experiences of being alive and the divine nature inherent in all of it, in all of us. In New Orleans especially, this is still so very true. Music is still entrenched in aliveness at the Crossroads, at the river, with the drums of Congo Square and the dead walking beside brass bands and their beloved alive people throughout the narrow streets. Everyone, one and the same, in the rhythm and the music. A strange electricity of improvisation that makes you feel for just a moment that the musician disappears and something else moves through them that you can connect to in a time out of time. And perhaps when a trumpet cries out late at night somewhere in the quarter, or when a funeral procession transforms grief into celebration and dance, or when blues guitarists play so beautifully that it hurts, we are hearing the echoes of something timeless, something humans have always been hardwired to know. That rhythm can alter our consciousness, and the thresholds that those rhythms bring us to are utterly ruinous in the best, most beautiful, divine way. It can help us dissolve our self into a greater oneness, something that we all seek and all crave. Thank you for walking these old roads with me tonight, dear listener. My name is Wishamaya. Watch the shadows and listen for the music. And don't forget to keep your roots deep and your dreams